Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see you're all sitting comfortably. So am I. And before you object and suggest that I should be standing, let me remind you that in the scriptures, the Lord sat and taught. I learned to do this actually in Siberia, where it is normal for people to sit while they give lectures. But it's a pleasure to be with you to have a very brief look at the book of Daniel. The first question I'd like to think about is, why should we take this book seriously at all? And the answer is to be seen in the trial of our Lord. When he was put on oath by the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." In that statement, Jesus was claiming to be the glorious figure that Daniel had seen 5 centuries before in his vision of chapter 7. And they crucified him for this claim. In other words, Jesus was crucified by claiming to be a person foreseen by Daniel. And that is a very good reason for taking Daniel seriously. The second reason is this, that Daniel and his 3 friends were remarkable because they not only maintained their devotion in God. Many people do, of course. They keep going to church and they say their prayers regularly. But what happens to them, as I have noticed, they often lose their cutting edge of witness. Daniel and his friends did not. They witnessed to high old age. And that was one of the things that brought me very close to the book of Daniel, because my response was simply this: if I can learn something from this book that helps me to maintain my witness sharp for God, then that would have been well worthwhile. Now, we'll have a look very briefly to what's going on. Daniel was probably only 15 when he and his friends were removed from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, who'd invaded the country. And he took them to Babylon. Jerusalem was a relatively small city. Babylon was a swinging culture, a spectacular city, the biggest in the ancient world, with all kinds of advanced things in terms of architecture, music, literature, libraries. You name it, they had it. It was also one of the most idolatrous cities in the ancient world. Now just think for a moment. Those boys left a monotheistic culture in Jerusalem, and they were plunged into a polytheistic, idolatrous culture in Babylon. It took maybe a week or 2 to get there. So they moved geographically into a new culture. Now, many of us, particularly people of my kind of generation, we haven't moved geographically, but the culture has changed around us. And many of you will feel exactly the same, that the culture today is massively different from what it was a relatively few years ago. So we can identify with them. And it was amazing what Daniel was up against. First of all, he had to learn a lot of new things. He had to learn a new language, new laws, new customs, because he was enrolled in King's College, Babylon, to study administration. Now, we need to understand that what Nebuchadnezzar did was to choose the best and brightest people from the countries he overcame, put them through his education system. The very best of them he kept in Babylon. The others he sent back to their own countries to rule for Babylon. Now, just let's think a bit about the book. It's a very unusual book because it's the only book in the Bible that has two languages in it in the original text. Part of it is in Hebrew and part of it is in Aramaic. And scholars have debated uphill and down dale as to what that could mean. Now, I don't claim to be a scholar, so I plunge in where angels fear to tread. I think perhaps the answer to the literary language question in Daniel may be very simple, because not all of the book is written by Daniel. In the middle of it, in chapter 4, there is the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, how he came to believe in God. And that bit is written in the common language of the day, Aramaic. So Daniel functions as a kind of tract where confession is made by the emperor how he came to believe in the one true God. Think of it today. If we had such a little booklet written by some of the world leaders how they came to know God, we would use it, wouldn't we? So you can think of Daniel in that way. The special bit, and there is more written in Aramaic, but that special bit of Nebuchadnezzar's testimony seems to me to be absolutely crucial. Now, Daniel is a controversial book, and it predicts the future in its second half so accurately that people who do not believe in supernatural revelation believe the book was written in the 2nd century when all the predicted elements, so they think, were fulfilled. I do not believe that. And I believe the book itself argues that it is a supernatural revelation of God written in the 5th century. Now, I happen to have written a book on Daniel, and if you want to know more about what I think about that, I would refer you to my book. But there are various things about the book of Daniel that have been established by historical evidence outside Daniel. For example, here is a tablet found at the ziggurat of Ur, where Abraham was born, and it talks about Nabonidus rebuilding the ziggurat. And we even have a Babylonian chronicle at the British Museum which mentions the capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. So there are various bits of evidence that authenticate this book. But we want to study what the book actually says. And one of the things that is very interesting is to have a look at how it is structured and organized. The first thing you will notice is it is not completely chronological. The revelations of chapters 7 and 8 occur before in time chapter 6. So it's not quite chronological, nor is it neatly divided into prophecy and narrative, because chapter 2, although it is narrative, is also partly prophecy. So if we stand back from this book, we'll have a look at its literary structure and thought flow. Now, one way of really getting into it is to make a table of contents. And for the book of Daniel, that's relatively easy. Chapter 1 describes the 4 at university and culminates with them refusing to eat the king's food. It's a scene in the center of the palace, the administration of Babylon. Then we have chapter 2, which is Nebuchadnezzar's dream image, where he saw an image of a colossal man, and Daniel interpreted that dream for him. And he was told by Daniel that he was the head of gold seen in this colossal image. Well, I think that may have gone to his head, because the next thing we read is that Nebuchadnezzar set up an actual golden image in Babylon and commanded all his elite people to bow down to it. And there's a famous story of the fiery furnace. Then in chapter 4, we read about the discipline and restoration of Nebuchadnezzar. His ego was soaring high above the heavens, and he looked at Babylon and he said, "Is not this great Babylon that I built for my glory?" and so on. And God cut him down. And for 7 years he ate grass like an animal. And then God restored him to his glory. Then in chapter 5, we have the judgment and death of Belshazzar. Remember Belshazzar? He made a colossal feast, and he insulted God by bringing the golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem into his palace, set them on the tables, filled them with wine, and insisted that his nobles worship the pagan gods in these vessels that actually were symbols of the holiness of the one true God. And a hand wrote on the wall, "You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting." And in that night, Belshazzar was slain. Daniel reminded him of what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but Belshazzar ignored it all, insulted God, died that night, and that night the dominion of the Babylonian kingdom ended. And that is the first half of the book of Daniel. It ties together because every section of it mentions Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Babylon then became the center of the new empire of Medo-Persia. The Medo-Persians took it almost without resistance, and so Daniel was still there, but it was a new empire ruling from Babylon. So you have chapter 6. Daniel refuses to pray to the king, and he ends up in the lion's den, as you know. Then chapter 7, we have a vision that Daniel saw of 4 animals. Then in chapter 8, we have a vision of 2 animals. Then in chapter 9, we have a famous exposition of Jeremiah's prophecy about Jerusalem and the famous passage about 77 of years. And then finally, chapters 10, 11, and 12 clearly belong together if you read them, and they are an exposition to us of the writing of truth, as it's called, about the time of the end. So it would seem you have 10 clear blocks of material, but they are arranged in a particular way, because we start with administration in Babylon. That's chapter 1, and Daniel studying and so on. Then we have 2 images, one a dream image, the other a real image. And then we have 2 kings disciplined. We have Nebuchadnezzar disciplined, he becomes like an animal, and then we have Belshazzar, who is slain in God's discipline. And that's the end of Babylon. Then in chapter 6, you have another administration scene in the court of Medo-Persia this time. That's followed by 2 visions of animals. And that in turn is followed by the explanation of 2 writings. One is the prophet Jeremiah, and the other is the writing of truth. Now, as you look at that, you will immediately see that there is a repetition of the pattern. And if you put those side by side, they look something like this. You have administration in Babylon paralleled with administration in Medo-Persia. Then you have two images paralleled with two visions of animals. Two kings disciplined, two writings explained, and then the end of Babylonian supremacy. And the final section in Daniel is the time of the end. Now, many years ago, I was very fortunate to be given a mentor who introduced me to a way of looking at Scripture in the way it was originally written and the way in which structures are built into Scripture to help us understand what is going on, to help us grasp the thought flow. Now, I won't have time to go into this all in detail, but I simply mention it, and if you want to follow it, then I have set it out in detail in my book. But these parallels are not accidental, but they're actually talking about similar ideas from different perspectives. One obvious one, of course, is the end of Babylon, and the time of the end in the distant future. So that must serve as a very rapid introduction to the entire book. But what I want now to do is go into one or two specifics. And when you start this book, you meet, first of all, a question of history. And it's very interesting the way Daniel starts, because, if I may read it to you, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Now just think about that. Jehoiakim was a very weak king. And here's Daniel writing some history. And he doesn't simply say Nebuchadnezzar besieged our country and overcame Jehoiakim. Well, that would just be relating history as a historian would. But he's interpreting history. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And I can see a secular historian reacting to that and saying, don't be ridiculous. Nebuchadnezzar had all the missiles, tanks, and everything else. This was a very weak country. This is simply an example of the survival of the fittest. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar overran Judah. That's all there is to it. But Daniel is daring to tell us that there is a Lord over history. Now that's hugely important, because you see, Daniel was a victim of this bit of history. He'd suffered because of it. He'd had to leave Jerusalem. He'd had to leave his parents. Well, this fascinates me, and it's important practically. Each of us is sitting here, and we are, to a large effect, victims of global history. Perhaps at the moment not so much in England, but think of people living in Palestine, in Israel, in Ukraine, and Russia today. The cataclysms of history, the ebb and flow of power struggles. To dare to say that God is behind one of them is taking a huge risk, isn't it? And yet Daniel, and I repeat, who had suffered by being taken out of his own culture and comfort zone, nevertheless, as he writes in old age, reckons God was behind it. So what is the big lesson here? It's a lesson we all need to learn. It's the sovereignty of God in history. Now that's a very complex subject, a very complex issue. But the interesting thing is that Daniel had settled down by this time, and he could accept what had happened to him that was negative, in the beginning at least, as God being behind it. Because you see, there are two histories going on simultaneously. There's first of all global history, and then there's your personal history. And our personal history goes up and down, doesn't it? And often the big question is, God, are you really behind this? And it's sometimes a major struggle and a battle for us to come to the conclusion, there is a God, and he loves me, and he's interested in me, and he has plans for me, and he's behind my history. So if that's the only thing you get from today, it's hugely important that God is interested in our history, but it may have its ups and downs because we don't see behind what's going on. But there's more. You see, the very next thing we're told in this chapter is that Nebuchadnezzar took the vessels from the temple of God and put them in the treasure house of his God. Now, we haven't read anything about Daniel yet, and we're talking about vessels taken from the temple. If you'd been writing the book, would you have even bothered mentioning them? Surely Daniel and his colleagues are far more important to come first than the vessels taken from the temple of God. So that makes us curious. What is that really all about? Well, what did those vessels stand for? They were mostly made of gold, the most valuable material at the time. They stood for values, and in the temple they shone as a symbol of the holiness and glory of God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar took them, and he didn't just melt them down. He put them in his museum of, well, you know, museums these days are full of they're full of artifacts that are taken from various places around the world, sometimes by very dubious means. So he gave them some value, but they were in his museum with lots of other artifacts from lots of other nations. Now, if you think about that for a minute, you'll see that what Nebuchadnezzar was actually doing was taking something of absolute value. It symbolized God in all his holiness, the one true God, and he made it of relative value. It was only one among many. Do you recognize that? You see, Daniel is telling us in his inspired genius what these ancient kings did, but we have it in our contemporary world. You believe in God, do you, and Jesus? Well, that's very nice. I believe in Mother Earth and crystals, because it's all just relative, isn't it? Is it? There's such a pressure in our world today to relativize the absolute. Now, what happens when people do that? It's not long before they absolutize the relative. They take something of relative value, like gold or money or sex or power, and they make it absolute. You read that in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue of this material, gold, and he commands it to be worshipped. So he's absolutizing, if you think about it, the state. Actually, he was absolutizing himself. Do we recognize that in the geopolitical landscape of our world? People wanting to absolutize themselves as supreme power. This is happening all the time. And so Daniel is giving us a brilliant insight into things to beware of in the 21st century by showing that they happened in the 5th century BC. So that raises the whole question of values. And what we find is that all of the first 5 chapters discuss this question from different points of view. So let's look at the beginning. In chapter 1, you have God's vessels put in an idol's temple. In chapter 2, you have an image of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And Nebuchadnezzar is told, you are the head of gold. after you, there will arise a kingdom inferior to you. Now, inferior is a relative term. And so this vast image, which symbolizes different forms of government, shows you that government in this world is of relative value. Some people don't believe that, of course. And they think that their government has absolute value. And that's been a very big issue in the history of Christianity, when some Christians thought they could bring in the government of God by power and so on. That's a huge story, of course. So chapter 3 is about values, where Nebuchadnezzar absolutizes the relative. But chapter 4 is again about values from a different perspective. Nebuchadnezzar looks at Babylon and says it was built for his glory. It was built for him. He mistook the purpose of his own existence. And that is a very easy thing to do. It's another question of values. And he was demoted to the level of an animal until he learned that there was a God in heaven, and God restored him. Pride is a very dangerous thing, and it comes before a fall. And then finally, we meet the vessels again. We met them in chapter 1. We meet them in chapter 5. And now they're sitting on the banqueting table. And Belshazzar has wine poured into them and forces his nobles to drink. And in that moment, they're setting God at 0. And the hand writes, "You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. God has set you at 0. And not only Belshazzar fell because of what he did with those vessels, the empire fell. That's why they're important. That's why they're introduced in chapter 1. And the genius of the way this book is put together is there's a build-up, analyzing values from different perspectives until you see Belshazzar almost allowing himself to be worshipped as God. And he is cut down because God has weighed him. God assesses all of us, of course. And there's coming for us believers a judgment day, the judgment seat of Christ, not to assess whether we're going to get into heaven or not. And mercifully, that's through grace by faith, and it's free and without price. But God is interested in how we behave, and we shall be assessed as to what we have done. But let's learn the lesson here. Our values are crucially important. And the big question in the contemporary world is, where do we get values from? Now, on Tuesday, I gave a talk at the United Kingdom Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast in front of a crowd nearly as big as this. And I raised that question. Here we are in a country that claims to value human beings, although you'd wonder about that in the votes that were taken last week. Where do we get true values from? And the irony is that we're still working on biblical values. The supreme one, in Genesis 1, God has made every human being in his image. And yet, alongside using those values, there's a dominant secular belief that human beings are simply a product of mindless forces and everything has happened by chance. You see, this business of values is very important today. And it's just, I felt I would take an opportunity of reminding people and the leaders of this country where our values come from. And I fear for nations around the world, because if you start setting God at 0, he might just set you at 0. So there are lessons here to be learned, aren't there? So we have a few more minutes, mercifully. The next thing is Nebuchadnezzar's educational policy. He educated them, and it's very interesting. It mentions the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar believed in training his civil servants, his high-powered administrators, in both language and literature so that they got to know the culture. And that training in language was to prove quite important at Belshazzar's feast, as you see. So here we are in King's College, Babylon. And the Dean of Students comes along to these men and renames them. Now, their names had meaning. In Hebrew, Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, the Lord shows grace. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, the Lord helps. And if you look at those carefully, you could see that you can preach the gospel from them, as I have many times. Their names were a witness to the true judge, God, to the fact that God is a God of grace, to the fact that God is unique, and the fact that he's prepared to help individual people. It's wonderful. So here they were in the university, and they could use their names because they'd been asked. They would be asked what their names meant. But that wasn't to be allowed because the Dean of Students renamed them and gave them all pagan names. They weren't to be allowed to witness using those names. They were to be homogenized. Nobody must be distinct by what name they bore or what meaning they bore. Babylon, you see, changes names. Is that significant? Oh, that's hugely significant. The whole biblical story swings on this, doesn't it? Do you remember where Babylon came from? In the ancient world, Babel. And the people then said, let us build a city and a tower that it might reach to heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves. The basic philosophy and ideology of Babylon was, let's make a name for ourselves. That ideology permeates our society, our schools, our universities, our businesses, and everywhere else. They built a tower. I don't know whether you've read much about the philosophy of skyscrapers. I have. And one journalist, Riley, said, behind every skyscraper there lies an even bigger ego. That's what it's all about. Triumphing and crawling and climbing, if necessary, above the next person so that you make your name great. What did God do about that? Well, he scattered them and he confused their language. But in the very next chapter of Genesis, he called a man called Abram. And he said, come out of all of that. But here's what he said to Abraham. You come out and I will make your name great. There are two ways of living, ladies and gentlemen. We're either sitting here desperately trying to make our own name great, and there's a bit of that in all of us, or we're learning to accept the level of greatness and significance that the Lord gives to us, and we're depending on him. Let me tell you a story. May I tell you a story? Years ago, I was speaking in another country, and I was talking about Genesis. And I mentioned this. And when I finished, a student walked from the back up to the front, and she looked at us, raised her face. And she was beautiful, at least one half of her face was. And the other half was marred by a very, very ugly birthmark. And as we sat in utter silence, she said the following. She said, I want publicly to say today, for the first time in my life, that I accept before God the way I am. I'm not a fatalist, but this is the way I am. And God, for some reason, has allowed it to happen. And he knows, and I accept that. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. And I remember sitting, and I was much older than she was, and I said to myself, have you got that far? You know, this is where a lot of battles happen, isn't it? The pressure in school to be liked on Facebook is colossal. Our young people face things that most of us never had to face. We've no idea what's going on the internet. That pressurizes people to try and make themselves great and significant in some kind of way that eventually can force some of them, alas, to commit suicide. We're in a culture that the pressure to make yourself great is as it never has been before. And we need to face it in our churches and in our witnessing and grasp this nettle and have some answer to it. Well, here's the answer to it to start with. Babylon may change your name and try and cut you down or get you to climb up. The lovely thing about the book of Daniel is he got the name of Daniel back in the second half of the book. Have you noticed that? They could change his name, but they couldn't change something deeper than that, which is his identity. Now, you see, we've had a look at this. Let us make a name for ourselves. And the Lord said to Abram, I will make your name great. And we could talk for a long time about naming, but I'm not going to do that because I want to just come briefly now to the question of protest. Daniel protested against the food in the university. Well, that's not new. Many a student has protested against the food, but this was luxury food coming from the king's table. And there's been lots written about why he protested. Now, this was a highly idolatrous country, the most idolatrous in the ancient world. And I cannot imagine that food would be served simply like that. There would be a libation to the idols and all this kind of thing, to the idols. And the interesting thing is Daniel resolved not to defile himself, says Scripture, with the food and the wine from the king's table. That hasn't been noticed by so many scholars. Now, Israel had food laws, distinction between clean and unclean, prohibition of eating blood, and prohibition of eating food sacrificed to idols, which all would have been reasons for Daniel and his friends not to eat them. But I suspect there's a deeper thing, because Daniel was not against wine in principle, because he mentions it later in the book that he hadn't drunk wine for 3 weeks, so he must have drunk it from time to time. What Daniel was protesting against, I believe, was the worldview, the ideology of Babylon. He accepted the education, he accepted the administrative position, but he wasn't going to bow to the ideology that was behind the culture. Now, that's a huge challenge for someone like me. I've accepted the education. I'm a professor at Oxford. But I determined in my life a long time ago not to bow to the secular ideology that lies behind so much of our education. Now, the dean of students was terrified when Daniel said he wasn't going to eat it. And what he said to him was this. He said, look, you are risking my head, because if the king sees you're worse than the others, I lose my head. If you go down this route of protest, you're going to lose out in comparison with your peers, and I will suffer. And Daniel said, look, just give us a trial. It's the first, by the way, epidemiological controlled trial in history, this is. Test us for 10 days and see what happens. So Daniel protests against their worldview. Now that worldview, of course, more or less said a whole lot of things. The main one being that essentially everything came out of primeval matter, which is very much an idea shared by leading physicists today, that either came from original matter or from nothing. And I'm not going to go into that because it's a big subject. The Babylonians deified the forces of nature, as many thinkers do today. But the point I want to finish with is this, that what Ashpenaz was afraid of was a question of image, not identity this time, image. And I'm going to finish with a story. Many years ago, I was 19, and it is many years ago. And I was sitting in Cambridge at dinner, and I found myself beside a Nobel Prize winner. And I started to chat to him and risked asking him a question. I said, sir, when you were studying what you won the Nobel Prize for, did it ever occur to you that there is an intelligence behind this universe? And he said very abruptly, no, and he turned away from me and didn't speak to me again during the dinner. But after the dinner, he came over and he said, Lennox, come to my room. Wasn't an invitation. So I went to his room, and he had invited several other, 3 or 4 other senior people from the university. And he said, you sit there. And they stood around me. And he said, do you want a career in science? Yes, sir. Well, he said, if you carry on with this belief in God, this naive thinking, you'll never make it. You will suffer by comparison with your peers. And so, I'm asking you to give it up before witnesses today, so you do give yourself a chance of making it. That's this. It's the same kind of pressure. And I remember thinking that if he'd been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd have lost his job the next day. But such is the uneven playing field. And I remember the Lord gave me something to say. I said, sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got in Christ? He said, the evolutionism of Henri Bergson. And I looked at him, because you see, I knew what that was, because I'd read C.S. Lewis and he hadn't. It was a very poor choice for reasons that I've explained in my book. And I said, sir, if that's all you've got, I'll take the risk. I'll go with Christ. And I got up and walked out. That's why this book is important to me. That incident put steel into my heart. And I resolved that if ever I got the kind of academic position that I now have, I would never use it to browbeat people. I would try to get the evidence for God and Christ into the public space so that they could respond to it. And Daniel has encouraged me to maintain, with the Lord's help, a witness in the world to relatively old age of 81. Thank you very much.